Good morning, ladies and gents. I'm just going to check that you can hear me okay. Is the sound all right? Can you just tell me in the chat? Or Mrs. Fox, can you tell me? Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Mrs. Fox. Brilliant. Thank you. That's lovely. We will get started in about 1 minute, okay, because we'll just let anybody join that's going to. Okay, good afternoon. It's very nice to see you, ladies and gents. We are going to get started then with our history taster session, okay? And I will talk you through exactly what the A-level course entails and what you need to do to prepare to study A-level history in September. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mrs. Baker. I'm team leader for history, and I teach A-level history. And Mrs. Fox is in this recording as well. And you can see her desk. There you go. You can see Mrs. Fox. And if you'd like to introduce yourself, Mrs. Fox, then you're there.
Hello, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Mrs. Fox. I can see some really familiar names, and I'm really looking forward to teaching history A-level in September.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Right, so you're going to hear mostly from me, I think. So if I just let you know that the session's being recorded, okay, and that means that you can refer back to the recording later on if you need to. It will be the recording will be available on the school website. So if you think I'm going too fast, I apologise. I'm just trying to get lots and lots in for you, okay? But you can always watch the recording back. There is also a PowerPoint of this session available in the files section in this team, so you can download that straight after this session if you want to. And there is also a booklet that has transition tasks in that I will refer to through the session in that files section as well. I believe it's also available on the school website if you need to download it from there. Okay, so there's lots of things that I'm going to refer to. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'm going to ask you that you stay muted for this session and you stay with your cameras off, and that's purely so that if we have lots of people join, although I think most people probably joined the previous session, then I can manage that quite easily. But I will ask you to get involved by using the chat box. Okay, so there will be times in the session where I'd like you to use the chat box to get involved. So please do. Okay, right, let's have a look at the course overview then. Okay, so if you do A-level study, A-level history, excuse me, in September, you will study 3 things, okay? So you will be studying 3 courses simultaneously almost, okay? So you will have 1 teacher for the study of the Tudors, okay? You will have another teacher for the study of Russia, okay? And that same teacher will also be completing a piece of coursework with you. So you will see there that the A-level is broken down into 2 exams that you sit at the end of year 13, okay, so that's the Tudors and Russia unit, okay, and 1 piece of coursework, which is about a 4,000-word essay, which sounds really daunting at this point, but is not so bad when we've taught you exactly what we would want you to do much later on in the course, okay. So the exams are worth 80%, okay, so 40% each, and the coursework's worth 20% of your final grade. And we don't do any exams that count towards your final grade until right at the end of year 13, and your piece of coursework will be submitted in year 13 as well, okay? We will do exams, internal exams, so exams in year 12 and mock exams in year 13 that will just help us and you to see how you're doing, but they do not count towards your final grade. This is a true linear A-level, okay? So I hope that makes sense. If at any point during this you have any questions, please just put them in the chat and I can either answer them on the spot or I can have a look later on or at a convenient time and answer those questions for you. So if you do have any questions, please just put them in the chat. So like I said, the very first part of your A-level course is an exam unit based on Tudor England. Okay, so this examines the roles of the monarchs, and an additional one, in fact, that you can see on the slide there. Okay, so we look at Henry the Seventh, Henry the Eighth, Edward the Sixth, who's not there, Mary the First, and Elizabeth the First. And this is the breadth study. So we look at this in the broadest terms possible. We look at each of those monarchs and think, well, how did they manage the economy? And how did they manage their finances? And how did they manage their government? And what kind of foreign policy did they conduct? And how good a king or queen were they anyway? And what was society like while they were ruling? And how did they manage the question of religion? Because that's a huge one during Tudor England, okay? And we divide this course into two parts. So AQA, this is the exam board that you'll be studying with. AQA talk about part 1 and part 2. So part 1 are the years 1485 to 1547, and you will study those years in year 12, and that's largely looking at the rule of Henry VII and Henry VIII. In year 13, you'll be looking at Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. So you'll be looking at the period 1547 to 1603, okay? And both of those parts together make up your final exam. The Tudors exam is 2.5 hours long. It's a completely written paper. The first question is about historical interpretations, and you started looking at those at GCSE, okay? And the other two questions are essay questions. Okay, so we do really focus on building up your essay technique, okay, and really making you great writers and great arguers as well, okay. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to provide you with a little bit of background into the Tudors course and set you up for the transition task that you will do over the summer, and then I'm going to do the same for Russia, okay. So you're going to get a little bit of a mini history lesson here, okay. So we're going to start by thinking about monarchs, okay? And we're going to start by thinking about what the kingly duties of a monarch are. Now, we can see our monarch there. We can see Elizabeth II, okay, looking very regal, and we can see some Tudor monarchs next to her, okay? Now, if I asked you what Elizabeth II's kingly or queenly duties were, okay, what are they? Tell me in the chat, what does a king or queen do? What are their duties? Yeah, so Elizabeth II doesn't pass laws, but she presides over a parliament that passes laws in her name. So absolutely, okay. But Tudor monarchs kind of did the same thing, really. They had to preside over a parliament. So yes, okay, they definitely control the legal system. What else? Yeah, good. They have to keep the peace, okay. So they have to make sure that England isn't invaded, okay, that the people don't hate the monarch and try and rise up against him or her. Absolutely. So they need to keep the peace. Anything else? Okay, so we look at a couple of definitions then. So a monarchy is a form of government with a sovereign head of state. And if we look at that word sovereign, it might not be one you're particularly familiar with, but it means that the power lies there. Okay, so the power lies with the head of state in a monarchy. Okay, now in terms of kingship, you can be a particularly great king, okay, or a particularly rubbish king. Okay, but kingship is the idea that the position, power is the position, power, and authority of a king or a queen. Okay, and it's the skill and aptitude that they have for kingly duties. Okay, now that might vary from monarch to monarch. Some might be great at doing these things. Okay, and others might not be so great. And we're going to have a look at that later on. Now, kings and queens, and they still are today, okay, although we don't believe it in quite the same way, are appointed by God, okay? And the part in the coronation service, and it still exists, so it happened with Queen Elizabeth II, it will happen with King Charles III when he inherits the throne, okay? Kings and queens are anointed with holy oil at their coronation to symbolize the fact that they have been chosen or appointed by God, okay? That used to be known as the divine right of kings, okay? So if you hear that phrase, that's what that is, okay? So therefore, if anyone wants to overthrow a king or usurp a king, okay, that's what that word means, then it's a sin because it breaks something called the great chain of being. Now, we don't believe in the great chain of being anymore, but 15th century people certainly did, okay? So let's have a look at the great chain of being, okay? So 15th century Europeans were Catholic, okay? And so they believed in what was written in Genesis in the Bible, that was that God had created and ordered the world, okay? And this order shows itself or manifests itself in the concept of something called the great chain of being. Now, I appreciate the picture on the slide isn't amazingly clear, but what can you understand about the great chain of being from that picture? What does it show you? Lovely, Megan. Okay, good. So we've definitely got some kind of hierarchy here, haven't we? Okay, we've got the idea that we've got God. Okay, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And God absolutely controls the king. Okay, etc., etc. So let's just have a look at exactly what that picture is showing you there. Okay, so it's showing you this hierarchy that you should be able to see on the screen now. It's showing you that there was a creator. Okay, and you can see that creator above and outside that hierarchy, that system, okay? That shows you that God created that system as opposed to God is part of that system, okay? So if you went back and you looked at it again now, you would see that at the top of that system, you've got angelic beings. Then you've got humans, and they've put humans in a hierarchy as well. So you've got monarchs, you've got lords, and you've got commoners. What does that remind you of? Think about what you studied at GCSE when you did the Normans. What does this remind you of? If I give you the initials FS, what does it remind you of? What does humans in three estates remind you of, Prisha? So you've got monarchs, lords, and commoners. What does that structure remind you of? Abby, well done. The feudal system. Great. Okay. Well done. Well done. Okay. So you've got the idea of the feudal system here. This absolutely still exists. Okay. In Tudor England. Okay. So we're looking at about 500 years on, a bit less, 400 years on from William the Conqueror, and this still exists, the feudal system. Okay. You've then got, in this great chain of being, animals in two tiers. So we've broken it down. Some animals are more important than others. Okay. We've got plants and we've got minerals and inanimate objects right at the bottom. Okay. And everybody has to behave according to the status that they have within the system, and they have expected roles. Okay. And they need to fulfill those roles. So if we come back to the king or the queen, okay, if we come back to the king or the queen, and I asked you a question right at the beginning about what kingly duties might they be expected to perform. Now, if you're a Tudor king, these are the kind of things that will be running through your mind the whole time because you're kind of responsible for all of these things, okay? So you might want to know how you can save the souls of your people. You have a religious function, okay? You might want to know about maintaining law and order. You've got to do that, okay? You might want to think about what you do if your nobles become threatening. How do you keep yourself on the throne? Okay, who can you trust to give you advice? Okay, your nobles might have vested interest. They might be vying for your job. Okay, who are you going to trust? You might be worried about raising money. Okay, raising taxes. That's your job. You've got a fiscal function. Okay, you might be worried about the safety and security of the country. Okay, how can I stop people attacking England? How can I secure the borders? You also need to worry about what's going to happen when you die. How do you secure the succession? Okay, who's your successor going to be? Okay, you've got to be in the business of baby making. You've got to be in the business of having the right kind of heir. Okay, you need to know that you're going to stay the king, or someone is going to take over from you that is going to be just as good. Okay, and you need to be able to persuade the people that you are the legitimate king or queen. Okay, that's a really weird one for us because we just take that for granted. We just see the Queen all the time on the telly, on our currency, on stamps, on Instagram, literally everywhere. Okay, and because we see her everywhere, we just accept that she is our Queen. Okay, Tudor people did not do that. There was no mass communication. Okay, it would have been really, really difficult in some instances to even know who the monarch was because it chopped and changed quite a lot. And they wouldn't seem like a real thing to a lot of people because they just wouldn't be exposed to them, but they had to accept them as their monarch. And so that was part of what a monarch had to worry about. Okay, he also, or she also, had to make sure that they cared for the welfare of the people generally. So they've got an awful lot going on. Okay, far more probably than Elizabeth II does today, because her government fulfills a lot of those functions, and some of them just don't exist anymore. Okay, so if we think about the role of a monarch a little bit more, we might say that monarchs had lots of power. They had ultimate power within their realm. Okay, their realm in this case being England. Okay, but English monarchs had to juggle expectations and limitations placed on them as well. So that meant that they could use their power, but they had to take things into consideration. They had to follow the customs of a country, and they had to follow the customs of the church, because remember, 15th century Europeans were Catholic. Where's the Catholic Church run from? Not England. Where's the Catholic Church run from? I'm sitting too still, my lights keep going. Where is the Catholic Church based? It's still based there today. Where does the Pope live? Yeah, lovely. Well done, Abby. Rome, absolutely. So this is the Roman Catholic Church. So you've got a foreigner, basically. Well done, Nora. Okay, so you've basically got a foreigner intervening on your soil, but you have to let him. You have to let the Pope do that. Okay, so therefore, the king had to take counsel from learned men to ensure that he did follow the customs of the country and the church. Okay, he also was limited because he needed to pass laws and to raise taxes, but both of those had to be approved by Parliament. Couldn't just do what he wanted. The monarch had to be fair and had to ensure that English justice was upheld by establishing courts across the realm. That were part of their duties. All their ordinary expenses, all the ordinary expenses of government had to be paid from their own income. So they had to generate their own income through their own estates. And finally, we've got the idea that 15th century monarchs had to be popular. They had to be able to rely on support from their people, because if they wanted to declare a war or to threaten a foreign power or whatever, they didn't have what we call a standing army. So in this country today, if we had to go to war tomorrow, we have an army that is ready to do that. Okay, they're called a standing army. It is their ordinary everyday job to be in the army. Okay, that did not happen in Tudor England. There was not a standing army. And so they would have to recruit an army to be able to serve them if they needed one. Okay, and for some monarchs, that was a big challenge because they weren't very popular with their people. Okay, now, remember that great chain of being. If you upset the great chain of being, that's known as bastard feudalism. Okay, so we've talked about feudalism being that hierarchy. Okay, and when that gets upset, okay, that's known as bastard feudalism. I'll come back to that in a second. So before this Tudor period starts, then there begins to be a bit of a changing relationship between the crown, the monarch, and the nobility, so the most important people under the monarch. Okay, and this is one of the things that led to what we call the War of the Roses. Okay, and you're going to investigate that far more in your transition task. So the feudal system, we've already talked about that, meant that the king ultimately held all the landed property, which he then granted to tenants who had formal responsibilities. If you remember the feudal system from the Normans, William said, I own all the land, and he lent that land out to his barons, who then had responsibilities to manage that land and to stay loyal to him. It's exactly the same just before the Tudors come into power. But bastard feudalism began to take over, okay? And this was a contract system based on annuities, which were annual payments, or indentures, which were split contracts. So this is where some of those tenants started to get a little bit greedy. Some of those barons started to get a little bit greedy. And they started to say things to their tenants like, well, you know, we could have a contract about that. You know, you give me some money, I'll give you a bit of my land, okay? You pay me annually for that, okay? And I'll make sure you have a role in this particular area as well. And you can see how the feudal system was beginning to be split up, okay? That's known as bastard feudalism, okay? And what it meant was that those tenants in chief, those barons, were becoming overmighty subjects, okay? It meant that because they had this financial connection to the people that lived on their land, and those people then had kind of more loyalty to them than they did to their king. It meant that the overmighty subjects, the barons, could rise up and challenge the king because they could build what we call an affinity. And that means a following of men that would support them instead of the king, okay? Which gave them a big influence in politics and a big influence in society. They could probably raise an army faster than the king. And if they could do that, what could they do? What was the possibility? If these barons could raise an army faster than the king could raise an army, what were the possibilities for that baron? What might he do? Who might he challenge? So for time's sake, he might decide, that baron might decide, well, if I can raise an army faster than the king, I could probably challenge the king. Do you know what? If I'm more popular than the king, maybe I should be the next king. Okay. And that leads us, that kind of situation leads us into a period known as the War of the Roses. And you're going to find out more about this in your transition task. Okay. So if a monarch isn't very popular or doesn't uphold people's expectations, then it could lead to a usurpation, okay? And that's where somebody might try and challenge him and might try and take power illegally or by force. Now, we're going to focus in on the monarch Henry V. He's not a Tudor monarch, okay? So he was ruling before the Tudor era, and he had been a really widely successful monarch. But he actually died in his late 20s. He had a young son who was called Henry, who was Henry VI, obviously, because he was in the line of succession, so he became king as his father died. And he was a Lancastrian, okay? Lancastrians are represented by that red rose you can see on the screen there, okay? And he was in his minority. That means he wasn't really old enough to be the king on his own, okay? He had to rely on advisors and other people to help him run the country until he reached what we call his majority, okay? That's when he is old enough to become king. Now, when he did reach his majority, he actually wasn't very good at being king because he hadn't really been trained, because his advisors had just decided they were going to do it their way. Okay, so Henry VI had got married in the meantime, and his wife was a lady called Margaret of Anjou. Okay, and he had many nobles as well, and both his wife and his nobles were constantly trying to fill the gaps in the court that he'd created by just being a bit of a rubbish monarch. Okay, the fact he was a bit rubbish led to great instability. Okay, and it meant that the French were able to defeat the English, which brought a great big war that had been going on for a very long time, more than 100 years, called the 100 Years' War. Okay, to an end. Basically meant the French were victorious over the English, and it made us look incredibly weak. Okay. Henry VI was also diagnosed with a mental illness, catatonic schizophrenia. Okay, and both of those things meant that there could be a rivalry that developed between Margaret, Henry VI's wife, and Richard, Duke of York. Okay, now I said before that Henry VI was a Lancastrian, so that's that red rose you can see there. So Margaret of Anjou would have been a Lancastrian as well. Richard of York was a Yorkist, obviously, belonged to the House of York, and the House of York is represented by that white rose you can see there. And because they had this disagreement, this rivalry, it became known as the War of the Roses. Okay, now that is just a little bit of background, because part of your transition task is going to be finding out far more about the Wars of the Roses, because what the Wars of the Roses do is allow the Tudor dynasty to take power. Okay, starting with Henry VII. Henry VII, if I flick back, unites those two roses to become the Tudor rose. Okay, and you are going to find out how and why. So, to do this, what you're going to need to do is, when I finish this session, you're going to need to go into the files section of this team, and you're going to need to download the A-Level History Sixth Form Transition Task booklet. That's a bit of a mouthful, but there is a booklet. It's quite clear on there. It's a Word document. Okay. And what I want you to do is I want you to work through the compulsory tasks that are in the Tudors unit. Okay. Once you've done that, and it might take you a little while to do it, but they're completely manageable. Just do them in chronological order. Okay. It will make complete sense, the instructions there, when you're doing them. Okay. Once you've done those, I'd like you to complete the Microsoft Forms quiz that is linked there. Okay. Now, the link is also in the booklet, so you don't need to go back to this PowerPoint if you don't want to. The link's also in the booklet. It's very clear. Once you've done the task, have a go at the quiz, and we will then be able to see that you've had a go at, you've completed your tasks. Okay. And that's really important for us to know for September. Additionally, in that same booklet, there are some optional independent learning tasks. Okay. And you can complete those at your own pace, and you can do as many or as few of those as you wish. Some of them are a bit more creative. They're a bit more outside of the specification. So there's things like a bit of a watch list there, reading historical fiction. There's some places to visit, especially with restrictions opening up. You might want to do that in the summer holiday. There's also some tasks there to help you get organised for A-level study as well. So there's optional tasks to do as well as the compulsory tasks. Okay, now that's the Tudors. If you have any questions, Nora, I'll talk about the due date right at the end. Okay, it's in September, do not worry. Okay, but I'll talk about the due date right at the end of the presentation. Okay, so if you've got any questions about the Tudors, if you just drop them into the chat now, and I'm going to move on to the second exam unit that you will do in your course, and that is on Russia. Okay, so you're going to complete, like I said, an AQA A-level course, and their component 2N is called Revolution and Dictatorship, Russia 1917 to 1953. And just like the Tudors course, it's in two parts. You're going to study part 1 in year 12 and part 2 in year 13. Okay, part 1 is about the Russian Revolution and the rise of Stalin. And part 2 is about Stalin's rule. Okay, so this again is an exam unit, as I said, and it's just like the Tudors paper. It's a 2.5 hour paper, written paper that you'll do at the end of year 13. The first question is a sources question, so not interpretations this time, sources. And again, that's building on the skills that you started to establish at GCSE, okay? And the other two questions in the exam are essay questions. So again, we will be supporting you to build your essay writing skills. So if we look at part one begins in 1917, but we're going to begin our study of Russia just prior to that. And our study of Russia, as you will see in a minute, starts with Russia as a kingdom, Russia as having a monarch, okay? And they weren't known as kings in Russia, they were known as czars, okay? And the czarist system had been failing for a very long time. And in 1917, the Tsar at the time, a man called Nicholas II, was forced to abdicate his throne, okay? That abdication became known as the February-March Revolution in 1917. The Russians had a slightly different calendar from the West at the time, so we call it the February-March Revolution, but all will become clear in year 12, do not worry. And by October of 1917, the provisional government that was put in charge after the Tsar's abdication really hadn't been able to prove that they were very much good at ruling the country either. And they had been overthrown by a communist group called the Bolsheviks, and they were led by a man called Lenin. And the remainder of that part one is looking at Lenin's rule and how exactly he was able to establish a communist dictatorship in Russia. Towards the end of year 12, Lenin will die, okay? He absolutely did in 1924, a bit unfortunate really. There is a power struggle amongst the Bolsheviks, and Stalin eventually emerges as the undisputed leader of the Communist Party, and we'll see exactly how he was able to do that. So that's year 12. In year 13, we look at Stalin's rule. So once Stalin's in power, we look at his rule a little bit thematically. So we look at how he was able to transform the economy. We look at how he was able to control his government and society through terror, okay? And we look at his foreign policy as well. So we look at, if you look at the date range there, you'll notice it covers World War II. So we look at Stalin's role in what the Russians called the Great Patriotic War. That's World War II for them, okay? And we also look at the start of the Cold War. And if you studied history with us at Shenley at GCSE, you've already looked at that period, and you'll come back to it and you'll be very familiar with that in year 13. Okay, so that's a little bit of a potted history of the Russia course that you're going to follow. Now, I'm going to show you a bit of a diagram of what Russia was like in 1900. Okay, and I'm just going to ask you if you notice anything that might be similar to the Great Chain of Being that we've had a look at already today here. Are there any similarities between this diagram of Russia in 1900 and the Great Chain of Being? What do we think? Okay, so let me ask you a different question. Can you identify any of the groups that are represented in Russian society in that cartoon? So if you look at what they're wearing or what they're doing, can you identify any of the different groups in Russia in 1900 from that cartoon? Don't have to be in any kind of order. Just give me some names of groups of people in the chat. That would be great. We definitely have workers, absolutely. We have industrial workers right there at the bottom. Any other groups? Can you guess who some of the groups might be from what they say there? We rule over you, we govern you, we pray for you, we shoot you, we eat for you, we work for you, we feed you. Can you get? So we've got we work for you, the industrial workers. Any other groups? Yeah, lovely. Okay, we've got the Tsar absolutely at the top there. We rule over you. Yeah, good monarchs, Prisha. Well done. We shoot you. Who are they? Yeah, the army. Lovely. Okay, absolutely. We've got peasants at the bottom. We feed you. Okay, peasants and industrial workers at the bottom there. We eat for you. They're like the nobility. They're like the landowners. They're the people that benefit from everybody else's hard work. Okay, we shoot you, the army. We pray for you. That's the Russian Orthodox Church. Okay, and then we govern you. We've got the Tsar and the government over there. Okay, and the Tsar right at the very top. We rule over you. Okay, so you've got here a hierarchy. You've seen this kind of hierarchy before. You've seen it in the Norman feudal system. You've seen it in the Great Chain of Being. Okay, what does it suggest about the way Russia was governed in the early 1900s? Who's doing the governing here? Who's doing the governing in this structure? Are we happy that the Tsar right at the top here is governing everybody else? This is a very top-down society, isn't it? Does that make sense? Now that top-down society is known as an autocracy. I'm gonna skip your definition there. They were the Romanov family. We'll come to that in a second. Okay. And Russia was an autocracy, and this is where the head of state, in this case the Tsar, has absolute power. Okay, so autocracies can have a monarch, okay, like this one, or it can just be an individual who sees power. Censorship is likely in an autocracy, okay, so they're not likely to have freedom of information. The ruler, the Tsar in this case, can interfere in the economic, political, and social system of a country without limitation. Okay, so they are absolutely all powerful. Okay, now let's have a look at that Romanov family, Nora. Okay, so who was Nicholas II? Well, he was a Romanov. He was part of the Romanov dynasty. Okay, he was the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III, and he came to the throne when his father died in 1894. He married a German princess who was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Okay, he was also related to the German Kaiser at this point, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Okay, some of you might have studied him at GCSE. He was also related to the king, okay, of England at this point. So European dynasties, European royal families were very much linked during this time. His wife, Alexandra, was a really strong believer in the autocratic power of the Tsar, okay? And she said, you shouldn't change anything. You should resist reform, okay? We don't want to end Tsardom. We don't want to end your rule in any way, shape or form, or even really change the way that you are ruling. We don't want Russia to become a democracy, okay? Nicholas was a little bit like Henry VI. He was a bit of a rubbish monarch, okay? And he really strongly believed in the divine right of kings, and so he thought that God had put him there, and so he could do what he wanted to do. So he opposed the westernization and the democratization of Russia, okay, didn't do what the people said that he really ought to do, and he made a speech denouncing the senseless dreams of people who wanted democracy. So these are senseless dreams, you have to do what I say. I'm the Tsar, I'm in charge, okay? Now, later on, after the Tsar was forced to abdicate because he couldn't carry on in this position forever and ever and ever, Leon Trotsky, who was one of the leading Bolsheviks with Lenin, he said, Nicholas inherited from his ancestors not only a giant empire, but also a revolution. And they didn't bequeath him one quality which would have made him capable of governing an empire or even a country. What does Trotsky think of Nicholas II? Does he think he's capable? Does he think he's a good monarch? Does he think he caused the problems in Russia, or does he think someone else did? What does Trotsky think of Nicholas II? Just try and tell me in the chat. Okay, I appreciate some of you might be typing, but just for the sake of time, you can see that Trotsky thinks that he's really not a very capable leader at all. Okay, it says that his ancestors didn't bequeath him one quality that would have made him capable of governing an empire. Okay, he doesn't think he was a capable leader. He thinks he was a pretty incompetent leader, really. Okay. But he gives him a little bit of credit because he says Nicholas inherited from his ancestors not only a giant empire, but also a revolution. So he's blaming the revolution not on Nicholas, but on the problems within the Tsarist system already. Okay, so he says he didn't really stand a chance. There was always going to be a revolution in 1917. Okay, now if we have a think then about what makes Nicholas similar to a 15th century monarch, well, they both believe they were put there by the divine right of kings. Okay, and in Tudor times you could get away with that because everybody was very religious, and therefore ordinary people wouldn't particularly challenge that. By the time we get to the 20th century, by the time we get to Russia in the 20th century, you can't get away with I was put here by the divine right of kings anymore. You have to be a capable leader. Okay, and you have to be prepared to change to the wishes of your people. Okay, otherwise you're going to lose your leadership, and Nicholas absolutely did that. Okay, so you can see that in some ways he was similar, in other ways he was different. Definitely there were higher expectations probably of a monarch in the 20th century. Okay, you had to be able to fulfill those expectations to keep your throne. Okay, now I talked about these earlier on for the Tudors unit. I'm going to say the same thing for Russia. So at the end of this, you're going to download the booklet that you can find in files on this team. Okay, and there are compulsory tasks to do for the Russia unit so that you can prepare to start your A-level in September. When you've done those tasks, complete the Microsoft Forms quiz. Okay, remember the links are on this PowerPoint, which you can get in the team, but they're also in the booklet, so it's dead easy to find it. Okay, there are also independent learning tasks to complete for Russia as well. You can do those if you want to. They are optional, okay, but they are there to support your study of this unit. Okay, now in addition to completing the compulsory tasks and the 2 Microsoft Forms quizzes for Tudors and Russia, okay, I'd also like you to consider buying your textbooks in advance of starting in September. Now, some of you will absolutely know that you want to come to Shenley and will absolutely know that you want to study history. You might as well buy your textbooks now, okay? Because then you've got them and you can use them to help you with your research over the summer and things like that. You can start doing a little bit of reading ahead. There are 3 that I need you to buy, okay? So 1 on the Tudors, and all the details are there. They're also in your booklet. 1 on Russia, and another one that's on American civil rights, because that's what you're going to be doing your coursework on. Okay, you will notice when you go to buy that book that it's there to support an Edexcel course. That's fine, doesn't matter. I'm not interested in the exam course. I'm interested in the content of it. Prisha, that's a really good question. I know that the Tudors and the Russia book you can buy on Kindle. Okay, I know that because I've got it on mine. Okay, and I quite often use my electronic version. If you've got a device that you can bring to school, so an iPad probably, that will support an electronic version, you can absolutely buy it in that version. Okay, but you have to be able to use your textbook in school. Okay, so if it means that a physical copy is better for you, then buy a physical copy. You decide. Okay. So once you've done that, there is one more Microsoft Forms quiz that I'd like you to have a go at. It's not a quiz really, it's just a bit of a survey. It's right at the end of the transition booklet, and it's just asking you about some of the optional learning that you might or might not have taken part in. Okay, so to be really clear, you've got compulsory Tudors tasks to do and a quiz. You've got compulsory Russia tasks to do and a quiz. You've got another quiz that I'd like you to take just to round everything off to make sure that you're prepared for September. The deadline for all of this is Friday the 24th of September, but I'd like you to bring all of your work to your very first history lesson. That might be on the very first day of term. Okay, I don't know because I haven't got the timetable. It might be on the very first day of term. So you need to be prepared for the very beginning of September. That doesn't mean everything has to be finished at that point, but it means that you need to be definitely underway with your tasks at that point. We would like you to be able to start your units, your Tudors unit and your Russia unit, having done these transition tasks, okay, and using the transition tasks during your first lessons. So it's really important that you bring any work you've done so far to your first lesson. The absolute deadline is the 24th of September. That's for every transition task. Okay, right. I am running out of time, ladies and gents. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat now and I will stay on and answer them. And this recording will be available on the school website so you can access it back again. Okay. If you don't have any questions, thank you very much for coming to this session and I will see you in September. Thank you very much. You are free to leave. See you later. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.